All right, good evening, future human geographers. This is the first of your online lectures. Basically, what this is going to allow us to do is instead of taking up our class time to go over some of the concepts that we need to use, we're going to be able to just get the notes out of the way at home, and then in classes when we'll be using the tools that we need. Basically, today, we're talking about mapping and understanding spatial data. Sorry about the font there. What you need to be doing here is taking Cornell notes on this lecture so you know the key terms for tomorrow's little quiz. But mapping and understanding spatial data is essentially what we've been doing in class. You're just thinking like a geographer. If you take a look at this map on the screen, you're going to see that dark red areas have an increased percent in poverty, and that percent is shown on the legend here at the bottom. It's called the legend. And you can kind of pinpoint where those places are. You'll notice there's a bunch in the deep south. You'll notice that there aren't very many in larger or in more city-driven areas, stuff like that. But basically, this is what we call a categorella. And this is an activity that we're going to use where you're going to use different colors to denote the severity or size of certain things. For example, in your assignment, what you're going to do is shade in areas based on the least popular destinations so that we can compare them to the most popular destinations. So in this map, we have the least amount of poverty in the light tan, and it goes to the most amount of poverty in the dark red. There's all sorts of different ways you can do that. Using the same color is a great way, but you can also do two different colors, which we'll get into later. Space is a first term you need to know, and space is just the physical gap between two objects. In class, we were using the term distance. Distance is our way of measuring space. So the space between California and, oh heck, Kentucky is going to be all the way in here. Distribution is the arrangement of a feature within a space. So you can see here that the distribution of poverty within space, which is all of this stuff, is, consolidated in certain areas, or it's distributed more southernly. Distribution just is a way of talking about how things are arranged. When we put them together, what we have is spatial distribution, or essentially the way that a thing is distributed in space. We've been using the word patterns in class. That's a form of spatial distribution. Be sure to pay attention to the next slide. You're going to need it for your homework. You're going to need it for the rest of the class. Density. We've already talked density in class, but it's one way of measuring spatial distributions. Density is the amount of a thing in a certain area. You can have either low density, which you can see in the blue box, where there aren't very many cities, and you can see high density in the red box, where you can see that there are lots of cities in the same amount of area. Density is the frequency that something occurs in space, and it's measured by the total number of it's measured by total number by certain areas. So you would say there are 300 per square mile, or over in the red box, you'd say there are 1,000 per square mile. Here's just a night light. You can see that this also helps us measure density. Even though this just shows us where lights are, what we can see is that what we know is what light pollution is a cause of density. The more houses that are close together, the more light they're going to put out. And so even though this isn't an actual projection map, it is a picture of the Earth taken from space at night, we can tell where there's density by the brightness of the lights. Notice up here, we have the New York area. Here's LA, San Francisco, right? Big cities. We've got London over here. Look over here in Japan, we've got large cities poking out lights. We have the bigger city in South Africa. But what this doesn't show us is a correct measure of density, because there are poor areas that don't have access to electricity that also have high population. So be really careful when we're using those metrics. The next term we need to know is concentration. Concentration is just a particular feature spread over space. Basically, your concentration can be either clustered, meaning it's close together, so this is a clustered concentration, or it can be dispersed, meaning relatively far apart. So if these red dots were kind of dispersed, they would look more like up here. Notice how there's red and it's kind of cast out as opposed to here where it's clustered. Here would be a great example of clustered poverty. This would be a great example of dispersed poverty, which measures the concentration of a thing in an area. If you look here, what you can see are two maps. One which has a clustered area. Notice all the homes in the map that's roughly the same size are together. And over here we have more dispersed homes. Notice they're kind of equally far apart. Even though if you counted, they'd be about the same in about the same amount of area. One is clustered and one is dispersed. Patterns is the word we've been using like crazy. And patterns is just anything that pops up that forms a repetitive visual, I guess. You can have linear distributions. Generally, those are houses and things that follow roads, like in our maps, how we had the destinations that followed a linear pattern up north like that. Or you can have geometric grid patterns. You might imagine if you look down at a city map, you would see squares. And those squares represent a pattern. Obviously, those would be grids. So here's a great example of a city that has geometric patterns. Though it isn't square, you can see that the city is built based on these aqueducts, which are patterned in a certain way. So you could make guesses about where the houses are going to be. Well, the houses are going to be distributed in a pattern starting from the inside to the outside, getting larger, and then less so where you don't have those aqueducts.